Hello and welcome to SLA Spotlight, the podcast of Stuart Leach Associates, the litigation, disputes and communications specialists. I'm Malcolm Monroe, a television journalist, and in this series I'll be talking to leaders, thinkers, pioneers in the world of law, business, media, arts and much more. Joining us in the studio today is Andrea Coomber, Honorary KC. Welcome.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Andrea is a driving force in campaigns for human rights internationally, and particularly penal reform here in the UK, leading the organisation Justice, and now as Chief Executive of the Howard League for Penal Reform, tackling many issues from overcrowding, youth justice, gender, wider social justice issues, all hot topics at the moment. Welcome, Andrea. Can I begin by asking you just to talk us through a bit of your journey from being, training as a barrister, working internationally in different countries, such as Cairo and other countries you can talk about, and how that's led to your passion and your campaigning verve, if you like, for social justice.
Look, I think like many people, my passions come from personal experiences. I grew up in the bush in Australia, so in the middle of nowhere, in tiny schools with no kids, seeing a lot of injustice, seeing a lot of racial injustice. Aboriginal kids I was at school with just didn't have the kind of benefits and advantages I had. And I felt, I think all the way through my childhood into adulthood, that I had been lucky with lots of things, unlucky on some things, but lucky on fundamentally my ability to be able to, engage with the world. And I was driven to law through an aversion to blood because I didn't want to do medicine. And they seemed to be my options, the law or medicine. So I studied law really just as seeing it as a possible tool for social change. And I think it could have been journalism, it could have been politics. For me, it was law. But I have to say, sort of confessionally, I'm not a lawyer who sort of reads Supreme Court judgments for fun or, loves sitting around talking about the nuances of case law or statute. I'm a pretty poor black letter lawyer. I've always wanted to use law to achieve change. So I did that. Initially, I qualified in Australia as a barrister and solicitor. It's a combined profession in Western Australia. And then I moved to India and worked for a regional human rights organisation as a legal officer, which was a mix of dealing with really vulnerable people who had, Afghan refugees who'd left Afghanistan 20 years earlier when the Mujahideens had been fighting the Soviets, and dealt with lots of kind of pretty confronting cases of executions, torture, and prison conditions. I worked on early prison cases in India. In fact, my first day at the South Asia Human Rights Documentation Centre, I was given a case by my boss, and it was of a man in Calcutta who had been for 27 years what they call in India an under trial, which meant he had been in prison waiting trial for 27 years. So I got that case on the Monday. He'd been charged with murder when he was 19 years old, and he'd been under trial for 27 years. I got that on Monday and started kind of trying to get my head around it. And then on Thursday I was told that he'd died earlier in the week. So that was my first case, working in an international human rights environment. And then from there I moved to Geneva, where I worked for the International Service for Human Rights for a year. I then came here to the UK and studied at London School of Economics. I did my master's in public international law. My then partner was in Cairo, so I went back and worked in Cairo doing consultancy work for the High Commissioner for Human Rights, was Mary Robinson at the time, and in South Asia, Southeastern Europe. And then in around 2002, my relationship was breaking down, personal things kind of impacting on professional things. And I applied for a job at Interrights as a quality lawyer. And Interrights had been set up kind of more than 20 years earlier by a number of British barristers and academics to be a kind of international chambers for international litigation based in London, but litigating in other parts of the world. And so I was there for 10 years, taking equality cases, violence against women, racial discrimination, early disability cases, to the European Court of Human Rights from jurisdictions in Eastern Europe and former Soviet Union countries, working with local lawyers, and cases to the African Commission, African Court from African jurisdictions, all of them strategically significant cases. So we would select our cases to have major impact, maximal impact on the case law and therefore on changing domestic law. So I did that for 10 years. Latterly, for the last 5 years, I was the legal director, which meant I wasn't just doing equality cases, but we were doing cases on rendition, on education, on behalf of Chechen dissidents, all kinds of really quite interesting cases. But again, life intervened and I found myself with a small child, happily had a child, who was on a plane to Nairobi or Strasbourg every kind of week with me because it wasn't a job. I was based in the UK for 10 years, but I wasn't really here. I was mentally abroad. And so I dragged my poor son to all of these places. He had a nanny in Mombasa in Kenya who would look after him. And that didn't seem sustainable. And I was approached to become the Chief Executive of Justice. So, which I was my first kind of entree really into English law and the bar. I think I knew 3 lawyers, English lawyers at that stage. And really enjoyed the work at Justice, working kind of with the courts and tribunal system, with senior barristers and judges. And about 4 years ago, I was again approached to lead the Howard League. I'd been a member of the Howard League for years and had always really admired the work, but the previous chief executive had been in the job for 35 years, so I didn't think she was ever going to leave. And when she announced her retirement, I immediately decided to apply. I think the appeal was twofold. One was a head thing. I liked the idea of going back to litigation, which Justice doesn't litigate. I really wanted to litigate, and I saw potential in the Howard League, which had a really long-standing, well-regarded legal team, of blending strategic litigation with a really outstanding comms and policy function that the Howard League has. So I wanted to bring them together and to bring strategic litigation on prisons. But I'd also, a few years before that, started teaching on a law course at HMP Warren Hill, which is a C-categorised prison in Suffolk. And I'd given a lecture at Cambridge, and this very beautiful man approached me after the lecture, this young, handsome man. And he said, look, it's really fascinating to talk to you, hear what you've done. And I run a course in a prison, a law course in a prison, and I wonder if you would like to come along and get involved. I think you would enjoy it. So I got back in touch with him. His name was Jack Merritt, and he ran the Learning Together program at Warren Hill. And so I did that for a couple of years with him. And obviously Jack died at London Bridge in the terror attack, which was awful, beyond awful. And I think part of me also, I really enjoyed working with him and working with the men at Warren Hill. And I guess part of me felt like Jack was never going to be able to become the chief exec of the Howard League, which I'm sure he would have done a better job than me in due course. So part of it was heart and part of it was head. And I don't regret it for a minute.
I mean, the work of barristers, it can be very lucrative and it can be not very lucrative.
No, it's not for me.
But clearly, it's never what's driven you.
Never. No.
I'm interested, before we talk more about what's happening in the UK in terms of criminal justice, penal reform, you've worked in some jurisdictions, New Delhi, Cairo, elsewhere, and you mentioned Kenya, where you've seen some really harrowing cases. A man waiting 27 years for trial and dying in custody. Some people would think, well, these things happen in the third world or emerging economies. They don't happen in the UK. But is that a very misleading conclusion? Because actually there is, a great many problems here in the UK that you've encountered. Would that be fair?
Look, I think there is often some of the human rights violations that occur in other parts of the world are simply not going to occur here because of the strength of institutions. That said, I mean, I remember in November about 2 years ago, coming up to 3 years ago, I went into HMP Bedford, which is a very old prison, obviously in the centre of Bedford. It's the prison actually that John Howard famously kind of 250 years ago walked out of in disgust. at prison conditions. So the new site of Bedford Prison is slightly newer, but it is still a prison well over 200 years old. And I was in that prison with a member of our board and went to the segregation unit as our first stop, which was a subterranean segregation unit. We went into a cell that was entirely covered in mould. There were cockroaches, alive and dead, running around. There was a toilet. Your listeners probably may know this, may not know this, but most toilets in prisons, there's a single toilet inside the cell, which is right next to where you sleep. There's no shielding. There's no toilet seat, obviously. So you're doing your business right next to where you're sleeping. And obviously now we have two people in most cells, so you're doing that in front of someone else. But the toilet was, again, completely covered in mould. And there was a fresh toothbrush and toothpaste on the side because the cell was waiting for somebody to come down from the mental health unit. And right outside this cell there had been a dirty protest, which is where people throw their faeces around. And so there was a Perspex shield covered in faeces that had apparently been there for several days. And then I was told, the chief inspector had that day issued an urgent notification. Chief Inspector of Prisons, Charlie Taylor, had issued an urgent notification basically alerting the Secretary of State to say this is an unsuitable place. But every time it rained, the Bedford segregation unit would flood with sewage. And then we proceeded up to a wing and talked to the men, one of whom happened to be a member of the Howard League, because we have a large membership. And he showed me his cockroach collection of cockroaches he'd collected over the previous 23 hours, because we were luckily there for the 1 hour of that day that he was going to be out of his cell. And his cellmate was actually off at court because it's a remand prison. 70% of the people in this jail haven't been convicted or sentenced. And I left feeling sick. And actually that afternoon, I'd taken this poor member of my board who'd never been to a jail before, and this is his first experience. It was just ghastly. And I can remember calling Charlie Taylor and just saying, I get it. Like an urgent notification well delivered, like appropriately earned. But I got back and called one of our senior lawyers and just sort of started crying because I couldn't believe that I think it was 2022, people in this country were being held in these sort of conditions, and staff were being expected to work in them.
That is absolutely shocking. As a journalist over the years, I was at one time a Home Affairs specialist. I have covered reports by HM Chief Inspectors of Prison. I've been allowed to film inside certain prisons, including, for example, Dartmoor, no longer operating.
Now closed, yep.
And almost every time I've been involved in covering these kind of things, the response has been, we acknowledge the findings, we will learn lessons, we will improve. But certainly my impression, not as an expert like you, is that things have gone in the other direction. That I can't think of a time in my quite long years now of experience where prisons have been so bad as they are now. Would you agree with that?
I think that's right. Yes. And the chief inspector, you pick up any report of the chief inspectors and chances are he's going to be concluding that the prison is poor, unsafe, disrespectful to people's dignity, that it is preparing people poorly for release. I do find it shocking because, these are people whose lives are entirely controlled by the state. You have very few choices when you're in prison. I spent all day yesterday in two different prisons, a women's prison and a C category men's prison. And there's very little agency for people in prison. So the state has, I think, a really significant responsibility to keep people engaged and healthy and progressing through their sentences, because of all the 87,500 people in prison, all of them, bar about 65 who are serving whole life terms, all of them are coming out. So you need them to come out in a way that is healthy and pro-social, where they stand a chance and you're not setting them up to fail. Increasingly, I think, at the moment, every time the government speaks about anything, it's 14 years of the Tories running the country. And I'm sure that is true when it comes to prison. There's been a significant disinvestment or retrenchment of public funding from the criminal justice system, full stop, over that period of time. But that has resulted in prisons that have not had proper upkeep. Retrenchment of staff significantly when Chris Grayling was Secretary of State for Justice. Experienced staff left in droves. And you now have, and then sentences have got longer and longer and longer for more and more things. So we're out of touch with, so it's just a perfect combination of poor investment in the infrastructure of the actual estate, where you have flood sewage and stuff. Also, poor staffing levels and inexperienced staff, and then people who are just being held for far too long.
Well, let's look at one or two of these issues. The popular narrative, if you like, politically, from all sides, really. If you listen to phone-in programs on various radio stations, the common call is get tougher, longer sentences, more sentences, for almost every type of crime. So you can see why politically it's been a fairly unpopular decision, which has been done recently by necessity, to release prisoners early, purely because of overcrowding. So do you think that there's anything, as a campaigner, which you are, you can do to try and change that narrative that longer sentences, jailing more people for more things, isn't necessarily the answer?
Yeah. I mean, look, I think when I started this job approaching 4 years ago, and I started doing lots of media and callback radio and stuff, there definitely was lots of hang 'em, flog 'em stuff. Yeah. And I think there remains to be very poor public understanding of the fact that crime on the whole, particularly serious crime, has gone down significantly over the last 20 years. And that far from, the prison sentences getting shorter, they have doubled in that period of time. So I think the baseline is that the public has a pretty poor understanding of the nature of crime and then of sentences. And I think politicians have responsibility to show leadership and explain to the public that what prisons can and can't do. And we saw that last July from the Prime Minister in his first press conference, because he arrived to a prison crisis, that the prisons were about to be all full. And as you say, urgent action needed to be taken, with not a great deal of joy from the government, because no incoming government wants to just release people from prison. But there was a crisis, and the Prime Minister did talk about considering what prison can and can't achieve and is and isn't useful for, which was encouraging. But at the same time, obviously over time they've bedded into a more tough on crime narrative, responding. I think we have a problem at the moment where there isn't really an effective opposition, because the opposition is coming from the right of the political spectrum and the far right of the political spectrum, and the Liberal Democrats are having very little to say about. While they had a very positive, encouraging manifesto, and there are actually quite a few of them, they're not really engaging on issues of law and order. So there is no opposition. Let's
pick up on one or two specific issues. Overcrowding we've already touched on. Can you paint us a picture of what that actually looks like? Because most people don't go into prisons, and you go into them every week.
Overcrowded prisons can look like a couple of things. So the prison I was in yesterday in the afternoon, it involves just a lot of people. That is a prison where 3 of the wings still have no sanitation or toilets in them. So men are living in cells, sharing cells without a toilet. And so at night time, they have to ding a bell and get released. So in order to manage that, they're let out early in the morning and they're banged up late at night. But there is nothing for them to do during the day. So there's no meaningful activity, there's no education. The idea of any sort of rehabilitative programs. And I think, it's interesting in the last few weeks, various things I've spoken at, people have kind of assumed that there's rehabilitation or there's counselling or psychological support for people to turn their lives around. There's absolutely none of that. That's just gone years ago.
How has that happened? because
There's no money,
rehabilitation
Malcolm.
is a key function of custodial sentences. Punishment is one, of course, protecting protecting society from some people who would be dangerous, and rehabilitation.
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is I was told by a prison governor yesterday from a different prison that they've been told not to talk about rehabilitation anymore. They're not rehabilitating. They're going to just focus on reducing reoffending. So, the focus, I think, under at least the last Lord Chancellor, who was very punitive in approach, and obviously is now our Home Secretary, was that prison was punishment. People needed to be punished, and people in the community need to be punished. And we see that expression of that in the sentencing bill in various parts of it that's now going through the House. So, I mean, I think the frustration is that the prison crisis, I think, over the last year and a half has brought to the public's attention to the fact that prisons are in trouble. And when I'd go on Talkback Radio 3 years ago, I'd get a really hard time. Whereas now I'll go on Talkback Radio on LBC or kind of stations where historically I'd expect to get a reasonably hard time. And at the end of the conversation, the kind of, former Tory councillor who is interviewing me will say, well, this is just a waste of money. Like, this doesn't work. And that's the problem is, punishment sounds great, but it doesn't work. It doesn't keep us safe. And I think actually the best thing that happened to us in many ways, it sounds cynical, but was when Daniel Khalif went on the run from Wandsworth Jail in a very quiet summer a couple of years ago. And I think Home Affairs editors sort of thought, how can this be? How can somebody be on remand for 7 months? And why would there be no staff? And how could this happen? Like, what's gone wrong in a prison like Wandsworth that is a kind of an iconic Victorian that would make this possible? And the truth is that would have been possible at loads of jails because there are too many people in the prison, too few staff, and things get lost.
Let's talk about one or two other issues about prisons. I understand that the age of the prison population has risen significantly, and I guess one of those reasons would be the number of historical offences that have been put people into prison. But would it be fair to say that in some cases prisons are becoming more like an old people's home?
Yes. No question. I mean, I've been to jails recently where there are wings and wings of men in their 70s. I had a letter on Monday from a man who's gone to prison for the first time. He's 79 years old. He has a 20-year sentence. He's had to leave his wife of 52 years and his children, his grandchildren, because he pled guilty to historic sexual offences that he now regrets having pled guilty to them. But we also get letters from other people in prison, younger people, just saying that they work in reception and they can't believe the age demographic and the complicated health problems of people coming into prison. So that is the men over 65 go into prison now at higher rates than young people go into prison. You tend to think of prison of crime as a young man's game, but because of the historic sexual offences stuff, it's older people, and they're very difficult to manage. They're high needs. They're not difficult to manage in terms of kicking off and violence and those sorts of things, but obviously have physical, have problems with memory. I met a woman yesterday who's got really serious problems with memory. She's got dementia, an older lady, obviously. And, the rest of the prisoners are really kind to her and help her around. She didn't know where she was. She forgot what we were talking about, but there are whole prisons that are full of those people. And we have literally the palliative care units inside prisons.
One of the reasons that prisons are expensive or relatively expensive is because of the level of security. But when you're talking about 70, 80, 90-year-old people, do they need high walls and all that kind of stuff?
No, I mean, I think just as we have secure children's homes, which provide support to younger people, and those younger people, frankly, are a much higher need and need much more investment in order to be able to support them through the rest of their lives than older prisoners. I mean, I think we need to think about secure older people's environments, which are more proportionate in staffing levels. I mean, I was at one prison recently, which is a private prison outside Wolverhampton, which is the best prison in the country, Oakwood. If anyone wants to go to a lovely jail, I mean, as prisons go, it's fantastic. But, they have much more control as a private prison over over how they approach their population. And we went past a couple of wings of men in their 70s, a lot of them with wheelchairs and Zimmer frames. And there was like one officer on who's there to help them. And, but they're not getting into trouble and they're not taking drugs and they're not, they're just older men who want to play their card games and their board games and talk to their kids on the phone. And, they're I have to say, very sad places where a lot of the people who write to me know they're going to die in prison. And the oldest person I think so far who's written to me, who's a new member of the Howard League, had gone in for the first time at 88.
At the other end of the scale, and perhaps more concerning, is young people in prison, because surely rehabilitation is critical for young people who are starting their lives, their adult lives, in custody, access to other criminals and other influences. How serious a problem is that?
I mean, it's definitely a problem. What's interesting is that over the last sort of 15 years, the number of children in the children's estate, so 15 years ago it was like 3,000 children in young offenders institutions. It's now about 400 between secure children's homes and young offenders institutions, which has been really positive. So there are many fewer people harmed, children harmed. Of those kids, nearly a majority of them are on remand, so they've not yet been sentenced or convicted. Of them, about 75% won't get a custodial sentence. So you do still have, even within that population, a lot of people who've yet to actually be convicted of anything, which is extraordinary. So we now have a situation where we have secure children's homes across the country, which by far provide the best accommodation and support for kids. And then we have 3 young offenders in England and 1 park prison in Wales that are for children under 18. And the quality of that estate is extraordinarily poor. So you would think that having a much smaller estate meant that you could actually invest in those kids. But they're the most violent prisons in the country, places like Feltham and Warrington and Wetherby, the most violent places. They're probably the most violent place for a child to be, full stop, in the country, or anyone to be. They are violent. They've got very low levels of education. So children have a statutory right to 15 hours a week in prison, children in prison. In some of those jails in Park, they get education. In the others, they get, they're lucky to get 5 hours. And they're routinely locked up for hours and hours and hours, for 20 plus hours a day. So keeping in mind, these are 15, 16, 17-year-old children. So it is very poor. We're setting these kids up to fail upon release by not treating them with dignity and respect. And we know, there's loads of science we all know this, about young people's brains, their levels of neurodiverse achievement. I've got a 15-year-old son. He's obviously a law-abiding child, but he's sometimes an idiot. Like any teenage kid is an idiot. Yeah. It's not until you're 25 that your brain is really kind of... And so there's high levels of fight or flight. These are hugely stressful environments. Earlier this week, I received a letter actually from a boy who I'd met in Warrington prison, a children's prison, a few months ago, and he's now moved to a different prison because he's now 19 years old. And he committed a terrible... He took someone's life when he was 14 years old, and therefore spent 5 years now rather, in the children's estate. But was talking about how in that time, so having killed someone when he was 14, he went to a secure children's home where he had a very positive experience. Then a few years ago got sent into the YOIs. But he said in all of that time, nobody's sat down with him, no psychologist has sat down with him to talk about what's happened or to help him deal with what led to that offending, how he feels about that offending, how to move on from that offending. The only psychological conversation he's had has been for a psychological risk assessment, which is, I think, should be shocking for everybody. He's at least identifying that as something that he thinks he has needed, rightly so. But we provide these kids with so little support. And
it's
then
completely counterproductive.
Totally counterproductive. I mean, look, I think the good news is that people who commit these particularly horrible offences actually have the lowest rates of reoffending. And I've no doubt the level of insight he shows into his offending, and he's written this fantastic guide to his experiences of youth custody and what was good and what was bad and what needs to change. Incredibly articulate young man. And he's really kind of, focused on the future, because he's still got another, I think, 12 years in prison, now at 19. So our hope would be that he can obviously come out and reintegrate. But not every kid is going to have that level of resilience to be able to pull themselves through the prison sentence.
Okay, before we move on from prisons to other forms of social justice, you mentioned Wetherby as a dangerous, one of the most dangerous prisons. I understand that you were involved in getting some vulnerable women removed from that prison. Is that right?
Yeah, so Wetherby is a boys' prison in Yorkshire. It's at YOI. And in 2021, Rainsbrook's children's home was closed, which previously had specialist provision for girls in prison. So these are under 18-year-old girls. And Rainsbrook was closed after a scandal, and they put the girls, some of the girls went into secure children's homes, the rest of the girls went into a unit inside Wetherby Jail. So it's a boys' prison, and there was a unit called the Keppel Unit, which had a number of girls in it. And these were girls, frankly, that secure children's homes had rejected, because secure children's homes get to choose who comes into their estate. And these girls, again, some of them on remand, went into the Keppel Unit. And I took over for the Howard League on November 21. I think my first letter was to write to the Minister to say what is going to happen to these girls, because we'd been told they were going to the Keppel Unit. We were told that was a short-term measure and that a long-term plan for girls would be established. And for the next couple of years, every single meeting I had with a prisons minister or a youth justice minister, depending on how they structured the team, was raising the issue of girls, because we have an advice line at the Howard League for children and young people in prison up to 21, and we would sometimes hear from these girls. And we would also hear from the boys, actually, at Wetherby about the girls. And we were really worried about them because it's a boys' prison. And then last May, the Chief Inspector of Prison released a report on Wetherby from an inspection he'd done in March, where they'd spoken to a girl who for 2 consecutive nights had been stripped naked by teams of men, male officers, in an effort to stop her from self-harming. So she was a prolific self-harmer. In the middle of the night, for 2 nights in a row, they took all of her clothes off to stop her ligaturing, which was probably the only thing they could do, no question. The fact was, the girls shouldn't have been in a boys' prison, where the only officers available were men to strip her naked to protect her. So we had been for a long time, as I say, like asking ministers to sort this out. At that stage, we sort of said, "Where is your strategy?" It turned out they didn't have a strategy. That had kind of somehow got lost between ministers, which at the time we were churning through them every kind of 9 months. And there were varying levels of interest, I have to say, from one minister to the next as to how concerned they were about girls. We basically threatened to sue them if they didn't come up with a strategy for girls, and we made it very clear that we would be representing any girl in Keppel Unit.
And that succeeded.
It succeeded. We had thousands of people, 3,000 people sign our petition. It did succeed. And we basically, and through our litigation, basically said they needed to have a proper independent review of girls in the estate along certain terms. Those terms were picked up, cut and paste into a review done by Susanna Hancock earlier this year, who concluded that no girls should be in YOIs. And girls have all been taken out of the Keppel Unit. The problem is the state of the youth estate is so poor that they've all been taken to Oak Hill, which is the only remaining secure training centre. And Oak Hill, again, had a safeguarding issue earlier in the year. The Chief Inspector has given it an urgent notification, so it's basically in special measures. And that's where the girls are, in addition to the secure children's home. So the whole estate, and there's now a secure school, which opened last year, that has also now been closed temporarily, hopefully just temporarily, because the doors keep on getting smashed in. So we have a youth estate that is really struggling to keep kids safe.
Okay, you've painted a very, very pessimistic and negative picture of the prison service. Let's go a bit beyond that, if you like. First of all, alternatives to prison. Obviously, probation, community service, these are alternatives. The previous government under Mr. Grayling privatised a big chunk of probation, which has now been recognised as a mistake, and it's largely come back into public control now. But can the services that support people outside prison, either when they come out or preventing them from going in. Are they adequately resourced? Can you think of examples you've seen where they're not?
Yeah. I mean, for a start, before I guess your preamble to that question was criticising the prisons. I mean, I don't really think the problem is the prisons. I think prison governors and prison staff do their very best. The problem is they are expected to do an impossible job. And that's government policy that puts them in that position where you just have far too many people going in and not enough resource put in. So I don't for a minute think it's an easy job being a prison governor or a prison officer. And I think they're put in an invidious situation. And I know very many prison governors who just desperately want fewer people in their jail. I don't know any of them who disagree with the Howard League, frankly. When it comes to alternatives to prison, you're right. Like the probation service was crushed under Chris Grayling. I spoke a couple of years ago at the National Association of Probation Officers annual conference, union conference. And normally when you speak at union conferences, they're kind of angry. There's a kind of fervour of anger towards government. Whereas my strong sense from the probation union was just sadness. Like it is, I think, a broken sort of profession. And nearly every intervention involved people crying, which was extraordinary, because there has been an enormous savaging of the probation service. It's been stripped out of numbers, as you've described. It's been stripped out of expertise. So people are no longer specialised. So it used to be that there'd be specialist units of probation officers focused on sexual offending or domestic violence. No longer. Everyone has to be a generalist now, which leads probation officers to feel like risk is not being properly managed in the community. More than that, I think there's been a move away from thinking about, used to be, befriend, advise, assist. That was the job of the probation officer, was to support people as they came out of prison or as an alternative to prison, in order to befriend, advise, assist them in reintegrating into society, into the community. And that has gone. It's entirely a matter of risk management, because if somebody then goes on to commit a serious further offence, individual probation officers' necks are on the line. So they're hugely risk adverse because they don't want to be on the front page of the Daily Mail as a useless probation officer, and they don't want to suffer employment consequences. When it comes to the resourcing, I mean, the government's announced another 1,300 probation officers, which is obviously welcome. That will not come anywhere close to the 35% of the profession that has been left the profession over the last few years. And obviously those 1,300 are all new probation officers, so you're not getting experience. If you could recruit 1,300 experienced probation officers, that might start to make an immediate difference. And I think beyond the actual investment in probation, there's also that sense, talking to probation officers often, they'll say, look, I'd love to be able to refer this person to housing, but there's nowhere to refer them to. Like there is no housing in the part of the country they live in. So they have their hands tied because across the board there's been a pulling back of funding from basic social infrastructure. So housing, support services, drugs and alcohol support, all of those things have been decimated, much as the criminal justice system has. So there is nowhere to send people.
Let's talk about one or two other aspects of social justice. I mean, there have been, I think, well, many people would argue there have been significant improvements, for example, in the way that domestic violence is handled by the police and by the system.
Yeah.
A recognition of coercive behaviour, not just physical violence, a recognition that these issues need to be handled taken more seriously and handled in a very different way. So do you think that much of what we've talked about so far is about a deteriorating situation? Do you think that's one area where there has been some improvement?
No, I think there's definitely been an increased understanding of coercive control, a recognition of the harms of domestic violence. I mean, that said, I was in a women's prison yesterday talking to women convicted of life of murder. In this case, they were all women who were secondary parties to joint enterprise murder. So their partners had killed somebody and they have been assumed to be supportive or aiding or abetting. And in none of those cases they knew or had anything to do with it. But, we're talking to them about the lack of support they got. Like a good number of them were victims of coercive control or domestic abuse. They'd reported to the police did nothing. So because these are women who have struggled with drugs and alcohol, have problems with petty crime, they're not Sally Challens. They're not people who are nice middle class people with articulate, handsome sons to represent them. These are women who are perhaps more typical of kind of people who get into some trouble with the law. So I do think there's a problem still, and I was involved in a seminar last week. There's still a problem of convincing judges about coercive control and having judges understand coercive control. Too often, I think judges see obsessive behaviour from women where they're texting or calling their abusive partners a lot as a minimiser of domestic abuse, and that you were besotted. I mean, we hear this a lot from women who write to us. The judge told me I was besotted by the man who was abusing me, recognised I was being abused, but equally said I was besotted, and therefore that kind of somehow undid the abuse, as opposed to the besottedness, whatever that looks like, being another symptom of an unhealthy relationship. So I think we've definitely come a good way, like some way, but there's a lot more to be done, particularly in affecting, training with judges and sentencers about this, because I think women are still too often assumed to be in the driving seat of crime in a way they're simply not.
Okay, well, let's move on now to solutions, and I'm not expecting you to come up with some magic solution.
I have magic solutions.
But nevertheless, there are serious problems with overcrowding in jail. There is a lot of concern by some people that the wrong people are in jail for too long, that when people are not in jail, the whole criminal justice system struggles to deal and help with people, crucially with rehabilitation and preventing offending. You're a lawyer, a barrister. You've chosen to pick up the campaigns on behalf of many different people in this country and elsewhere. What are the legal or political or lobbying and campaigning levers that can be pulled to address this mess?
Yeah, I mean, look, you've got obviously civil society has a role, I think, in sparking conversations, providing evidence. Politicians ultimately are the ones with their hands on the lever, but they operate in a, as has become very clear, even when you have a very large majority, are quite risk adverse and are not necessarily going to be focused on what is the long-term benefit of the criminal justice system or of the community. So there's a lot of short-term sort of thinking. And, I mean, part of our job is to try to encourage politicians to be brave and to follow the evidence, because whenever I sit down with prisons ministers of all colours, they will say, the prisons are such a disaster, Andrea, they're so terrible, and all the people are vulnerable and blah, blah, blah. We think, well, this is all fine, except you're the prisons minister. You can do something about this. These people are your responsibility. But it doesn't, for them, it just doesn't necessarily feel like they have enough authority to be able to do that, because... And
their concern is that they will be considered to be
soft
weak,
on crime.
Soft on crime.
Yeah, the soft on crime thing is really strong. And I think we need to move to a kind of narrative that when you hear soft on crime, I hear dumb on crime. Like when I hear tough on crime, I think dumb on crime. If tough on crime means locking people away, more people away for longer, that is a bad solution for crime, and that's poor economics. The amount that prison costs is extraordinary. Each prison place costs, like every existing prison place costs on average £50,000 to £60,000, depending on categorisation. Every new prison place, the government's spending $10 billion building new prisons, which are just going to drive more people into them. It's like building another lane of a freeway, of a motorway. By the time it actually is built, you've already attracted all the traffic to it. So there needs to be proper investment in the things that the evidence shows work. And the government knows the evidence. The evidence, frankly, is all the government's own evidence of what works, and that is support in the community for mental health. There's been a direct correlation between numbers of mental health beds being closed down in the community and numbers of mental health beds being required in prison. Mental health, drugs and alcohol support, giving young people meaningful things to do, investment in education. I mean, when it comes to young people, you could talk to any head teacher of a primary school and they are going to be able to tell you the kids who are going to fall foul of the law in a couple of years' time. And they know that because they've seen these kids come through and they know these children. So there are lots of things outside the criminal justice. I mean, basically the answers to criminal justice all lie outside the criminal justice system. By the time you get into prison or you get sentenced to custodial sentence, in a lot of ways it's too late for you. We need to be investing in all those other things.
Could lawyers be doing more? The legal process delivers the end result or some of it.
Yeah, I mean, look, lawyers can only do what lawyers are often funded to do. And there's been, as you know, a massive, which readers, listeners will know, a massive reduction in legal aid over the years. Criminal legal aid particularly has been savaged. Prison law has gone completely savaged. We didn't get the return uplift from the last government that the criminal legal profession generally got, which means that it's very difficult then to bring cases on things. And arguably that affects the quality of people who are attracted to certain kinds of law. So, you have to basically have a trust fund or be willing to live in poverty if you want to be a criminal barrister, because it is a really tough road. And, you might be able to cross-subsidise your fraud and white-collar work with your, work in the magistrates' court. But it is, it's a difficult kind of profession. So, I mean, I think the legal profession does have some things to answer for. I mean, the quality of some of the defence of some of the people in our membership, I think, was really pretty poor, criminal defence.
That's interesting. So let's finish this conversation looking to the future. There is an independent sentencing review. There is some recognition that something needs to be done. I mean, perhaps you could finish this conversation by telling us how you think the current dynamics, politically, socially, are working, and is there any light at the end of the tunnel, Andrea?
I mean, look, I think there's lots of light, if only because the prisons are all full, and they can't build them quick enough. So the government is being forced into pursuing policy that otherwise perhaps definitely wouldn't want to pursue. So we've had the independent sentencing review from David Gauke and his expert panel, which, as I've said, the February instalment of that was a really good elucidation of the problems. It actually was very similar to some work that we put out last year from the Howard League in September, where we had the retired 4 Lord Chief Justices and Sir Brian Leveson talk about sentence inflation and how we've got ourselves into this trouble and the problems of ever-increasing sentences, because as senior retired judges, they just felt very uncomfortable. That a life sentence 20 years ago was 12, 13, 14 years, and a life sentence now often starts at 30 years. So they felt very uncomfortable about that. So the Gauke report in February and our report were very similar in that respect. And then the recommendations that David Gauke has brought forward in his main report, I think a lot of the tenor of that is to say that actually prison doesn't work, but is recognising that prison is there for the punishment element of someone's sentence, and then saying that people then need to be supported to return to the community through intensive support from probation, and then being allowed to kind of get on with their lives. And he suggests something called earned progression as part of that, and says that we should get rid of short sentences. He suggested earned progression for a large range of people. I think the disappointment is that the government really has not adopted the tenor of David Gauke's report. It's adopted a much more punitive tone, where it does seem to, a fair bit of it seems to be done through gritted teeth. And fundamentally, we welcome the lesser use of custody, but this report does nothing, and the sentencing bill that's coming from it does not address sentence length, which is what Gauke identified as the problem. So there is nothing in the independent review of sentencing that is about reducing sentence inflation or reducing anyone's sentence. It's just about the composition, how much you spend in the prison, how much you spend in the community. And they've rejected some of David Gauke's recommendations. So they've excluded people who are on extended determinate sentences, people who've committed very awful violent offences short of death or manslaughter. But some of these people have extraordinarily long sentences, 35, 40-year sentences, and at the moment need to get 2/3 of that before they can go to the parole board. And we're in touch with, there are 9,000 of these people, we're in touch with a lot of them, and they have committed a horrible offence in one moment. Very many of them have not got any history of offending, and it's been a moment of madness or stress, and they've committed a horrible offence. But the idea that, you don't let them go to the parole board. Parole board's not releasing anyone who's not safe for release. That you would prevent that group of people from going to the parole board at 50%, as David Gauke has recommended, and say, oh, no, it needs to be 2/3. We've got one member who got a 35-year EDS sentence, and he'd completed his sentence plan in 3 years. And he now has another 20 years to go till he gets released.
Yeah, I mean, you've raised a whole series of huge issues and problems, and you've spent your entire career trying to make things better. Perhaps we can finish up by and this might be not the easiest thing to come up with off the cuff, so to speak, but if you could change one thing, wave that magic wand tomorrow and change one thing with the British criminal justice system and prison system, what would it be?
Unfortunately, Malcolm, I don't think one thing would do it. But if I could magic, it would be returning prison numbers through any mechanism, back to where they were 20 years ago. So reducing the population by half, taking out all the people who are keeping prison for people who are dangerous and a danger to society and the public for as long as they are a danger. I don't see the point in keeping people in prison for 30 years when they don't represent any danger to the public anymore. Punishment, a move away from punishment and towards being more pragmatic around what prison can and can't do.
Andrea Coomber, thank you very much.
Pleasure.